The smell hit Nora Vivian before the sunrise did. Thick, sour, unmistakably wrong, drifting through her bedroom window on ground that had been clean, quiet dirt the evening before. She stood at the edge of her back field an hour later in her nightclothes and boots, staring at mounds of crushed grape skins and stems piled 4 feet high in places, still faintly warm from fermentation already starting in the morning heat. Truck tracks led away from her gate and back toward the winery's private road. The one that bordered her property line on the north side, the same road Gerald Fenn's crew used every crush season without ever once needing to come this far south. She understood exactly what this was. Not an accident. Not an overflow. A message, dumped in the dark by people who assumed a woman running 80 acres alone would have no way to fight back against a company with lawyers on retainer. They had no idea yet what she was about to do with their mess. If you've ever woken up to find someone tried to hurt you while you slept, thinking you'd have no way to fight back, hit like right now, and tell me in the comments where you're watching this from tonight. Because what Nora does with this mess is going to be worth every second of what comes next. 4 days earlier, none of this had even started. Nora Vivian's family had farmed 80 acres in Corda Valley for 3 generations, growing stone fruit and vegetables on ground that had never once belonged to the wine business surrounding it on every side. That had become a problem for the winery next door. Their operation had grown fast through the wine boom years, buying up smaller parcels across the valley to expand vineyard acreage, and Nora's land, flat, well-watered, perfectly positioned along the estate's northern boundary, had been at the top of their list for over a year. She'd turned down 3 separate offers, each one higher than the last, each one delivered with the same polite insistence that surely she understood what an opportunity this was. Nora understood exactly what it was. It just wasn't an opportunity she had any interest in taking, not for money, not for anything else they seemed to think might eventually change her mind. Gerald Fenn drove out personally that September, clipboard in hand, the same practiced smile he brought to every negotiation he'd ever walked Nora through. "This is our best offer, Ms. Vivian, and I'll be honest with you, it's not going to stay on the table indefinitely. The estate's expansion plans don't really account for holdouts. Then I suppose you'll have to plan around 80 acres that aren't for sale, Mr. Fenn. Same as I've told you the last 3 times you've driven out here." Fenn's smile didn't waver, but something behind it did. "I hope you understand there are consequences to being difficult in a valley this small. Reputation matters out here. Cooperation matters." He folded his clipboard closed. "I'll let the ownership know your answer hasn't changed." He left without saying anything more direct than that, but Nora stood in her driveway a long moment after his car pulled away, turning that word, consequences, over in her mind, wondering exactly what shape it might eventually take. Corda Valley had changed fast in the years since the wine world started paying serious attention to California, and not every change had been gentle. Land prices climbed. Small independent growers who'd farmed modestly for decades found themselves sitting on ground suddenly worth far more to a winery's expansion plans than to any crop they could grow on it themselves. Some sold and moved on. Others, like Nora, held out and found the pressure to give in came in forms that rarely showed up on paper. Slower service from suppliers with winery ties, a produce buyer who mysteriously stopped calling, whispers at the co-op about difficult women who didn't know a good deal when they saw one. Nora had weathered all of it so far without much more than a stubborn tightening of her jaw. She didn't yet know how much further Gerald Fenn's idea of consequences was willing to go. Frank Alcala had worked Nora's farm for 11 years, long enough that he didn't need to be told something was wrong the morning he found her standing at the edge of the back field, still in her nightclothes, staring at 4-foot mounds of dumped grape waste. "That's crushed pomace," he said, walking the edge of it slowly, one hand pressed briefly to his nose against the smell. "Whole truckloads of it, looks like. This isn't spillover, Nora. Somebody drove out here on purpose and did this." I know exactly who. She nodded toward the tire tracks leading back toward the estate's private road. Gerald Fenn told me there'd be consequences. I suppose this is what he meant. Frank didn't say anything for a moment, just looked out over the ruined section of field, doing the same quiet math Nora had already started doing herself. What this would cost to clean up, what it would cost to fight, what it would cost simply to survive being made an example of. Well, he finally said. Let's go see how bad it actually is. The full scope of it stretched across nearly 3 acres, crushed skins, seeds, stems, and pulp, dumped in uneven mounds that had already begun fermenting in the warm September air, the smell thick enough to reach the county road half a mile off. Nora called the county that morning, same as she imagined any farmer would. The deputy who came out took photographs, noted the tire tracks, promised to look into which local operation might be responsible for an unauthorized dump this size during crush season, though he was honest enough to admit, standing at the edge of the mess, that proving it without a witness or a paper trail was going to be difficult. Nora understood, standing in that field with Frank and a deputy who clearly had his doubts, that whatever happened next was going to be almost entirely up to her. Nobody was going to hand her justice. She was going to have to build it herself, out of the very mess somebody had dumped on her land to break her. If you've ever had someone try to punish you simply for refusing to give them what they wanted, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because Nora was about to turn that punishment into something nobody in this valley expected. Subscribe now, because you won't want to miss what she does next. Word moved through Corda Valley fast, the way it always did about anything involving the wine estates and their smaller neighbors. Most of it landed on Nora exactly the way Gerald Fenn had probably hoped it would. At the co-op, the sympathy came wrapped in a familiar kind of resignation. Shame what happened to Nora Vivian's backfield. Maybe this is finally what convinces her to sell. Nobody said it was deserved, exactly. But there was an undertone in most of the conversation that assumed the outcome was already decided, that a woman facing 3 ruined acres and no real legal recourse would eventually just take the money and be done fighting a company with more lawyers than she had years left in her. Nora heard most of it secondhand, the way bad talk about yourself always traveled. She let people believe whatever they wanted to believe about how this would end. She had a different idea already taking shape, one she hadn't told anyone yet, not even Frank. She'd read a small item months earlier in a farm trade bulletin, almost in passing, about vineyards in Europe composting their own grape waste and returning it to the soil as a nutrient-rich amendment. She hadn't thought much of it at the time. She had no vineyard of her own, no reason to need it. Standing at the edge of 3 fermenting acres that didn't belong there, the idea came back to her with an entirely different weight. If pomace, properly handled, could become something valuable instead of something wasted, then maybe the very mess meant to break her could become the thing that finally gave her some leverage she'd never had before. She didn't say any of this to Frank yet, not fully formed. She just asked him, that evening, whether he thought they could figure out how to compost 3 acres worth of dumped grape waste without either of them knowing the first real thing about how to do it properly. I reckon we can learn, Frank said. Farming's mostly just learning things the hard way until they stop being hard. Nora tracked down an independent soil consultant working out of the county that fall, a woman named Renata Cross who'd built a modest reputation helping small growers manage exactly the kind of organic waste problems bigger operations usually just paid to haul away. Renata walked the dumped field slowly, taking samples, asking careful questions about moisture and volume and what Nora actually hoped to do with the finished result. Raw like this, it's a problem, she said, crouching to examine a handful of fermenting pomace. Too acidic, too concentrated, and honestly it'll draw fruit flies and mold faster than anything useful happens on its own. But composted properly, balanced out with the right ratio of straw and manure, kept at the right moisture and temperature, this is genuinely valuable material. Grape pomace compost is something vineyards actively want. It's rich in nitrogen, potassium, calcium. There's real research behind using it specifically to rebuild vineyard soil health. Nora stood there a long moment, feeling something shift for the first time since she'd woken up to that smell 4 days earlier. So the same stuff they dumped on me to ruin my land is something the wine business actually wants. If it's handled right, Renata said. Which is the part most operations don't bother doing properly. Because it takes real time and real care most big estates don't want to spend on their own waste. Renata spent the better part of that afternoon walking Nora and Frank through exactly what proper composting would require. A careful blend of the raw pumice with straw and aged manure. Moisture held steady. The pile turned regularly to keep oxygen moving through it. Internal temperature climbing high enough during the active phase to break the material down safely and evenly. It wasn't fast. Renata was honest about that from the start. Real, finished compost would take months, not weeks, and it would require more consistent labor than either Nora or Frank had budgeted time for that season. But for the first time since the dumping, Nora was looking at an actual method instead of just a problem to survive. Real science, tested and documented, turning exactly the kind of waste that had been used against her into something the very industry that dumped it might eventually have to come back and ask for. This is the exact moment the mystery in this story becomes something you could go verify yourself. Composted grape pomace is real, documented, valuable material, used by vineyards around the world to rebuild soil health. If stories built on real agricultural science instead of made-up magic are what you're here for, subscribe now, because that's exactly what this channel does every single episode. Nora and Frank spent that fall and winter building proper compost windrows out of the dumped pumice, hauling in straw and manure from 2 neighboring farms willing to trade for it, turning the piles by hand on a schedule Renata had written out for them in careful, exact detail. It was slow, physical, unglamorous work, made harder by a wet winter that complicated the moisture balance more than once and forced them to rebuild sections of the pile from scratch. Nora tracked every turn, every temperature reading, every adjustment in the same ledger she used for the rest of the farm's business, the record of exactly how a disaster became a discipline. Word got around the valley about what she was doing, and most of it came back to her filtered through the same tone the earlier sympathy had carried, bemused. A little pitying, the general sense that Nora Vivian had found an odd way to cope with a bad situation instead of simply taking the money like everyone assumed she eventually would. Owen Castellano farmed a modest parcel of his own grapes 2 properties over, independent like Nora, skeptical of most things that didn't show results in a season or 2. Compost's compost, Nora, he told her one afternoon at the feed store, not unkindly, just plainly. I don't doubt you're working hard out there. I just don't know that hard work turns dumped garbage into something a real winery's going to want to pay for. Renata says the science holds up. European vineyards have been doing this for years. Europe's not Corda Valley. Owen shrugged. I hope you're right. I just wouldn't want to see you spend a whole winter's labor on something that doesn't pay off in the end. Nora didn't have a certain answer for him yet, not one she could prove. She just knew she wasn't interested in spending another season waiting for Gerald Fenn's company to make her an offer she'd keep refusing anyway. By early spring, the first section of properly finished compost was ready. Dark, crumbling, rich smelling in a way that bore almost no resemblance to the fermenting mess it had started as 4 months earlier. Renata tested it thoroughly before Nora did anything else with it, confirming nutrient levels and stability that matched, and in some measures exceeded, the commercial vineyard compost products Renata had seen used across the county. Nora applied a modest test section to her own small experimental block of vines, a handful of vines she'd planted years earlier mostly out of curiosity, never expecting them to matter much to the farm's real business. She watched that test block through the growing season with the same obsessive attention she'd once watched the compost piles themselves. tracking every measurable difference against a comparable untreated section nearby. By midsummer, the difference was impossible to argue with. The treated section of Nora's small experimental vine block showed noticeably deeper leaf color, stronger cane growth, and fruit clusters developing more evenly than the untreated comparison rows just a few feet away. Renata brought a colleague out to see it that August, someone who worked more directly with several of the valley's wine estates, and the two of them spent a full afternoon taking measurements, comparing notes, treating Nora's modest test plot with the same careful attention Renata had once given the dumped pomace itself. "I've tested a lot of vineyard compost products," Renata told Nora afterward. "Most of them are fine. This is better than fine. This is some of the most balanced material I've worked with in years, and it started as 3 acres somebody dumped on you to try to run you off your own land." Renata came back out that September with something in her voice Nora hadn't heard from her before, not just professional satisfaction, but genuine, unsettled curiosity. "I sent a sample off to a lab contact of mine who studies vineyard soil microbiology," she said, spreading a set of results across Nora's kitchen table. "The microbial diversity in this compost isn't just good, Nora. It's old. The kind of established fungal and bacterial community that usually only develops under vine roots left undisturbed for generations. You don't get diversity like this from a young block, or from ordinary crush waste mixed together indiscriminately. It's just pomace, Renata. Whatever they crushed that season. That's what I thought too, until I asked around about which specific block might have been harvested and dumped rather than pressed for wine that year." Renata's expression had gone careful now, weighing how much to say. "There's talk in the valley. Quiet talk, not the kind anyone wants printed anywhere, that the estate pulled out their original home block that same season. The vines their founder planted 3 generations back. Word is they replaced it with something more fashionable and didn't make much noise about it, because heritage vine people around here would have raised hell if they'd known." Nora sat with that a long moment, feeling the shape of something much larger than a petty act of spite settling over what had happened to her that September night. It didn't take long, once Renata's quiet question started circulating, for the rest of the story to come together. A former vineyard hand who'd worked the estate for over a decade confirmed it to Owen Castellano over a beer at the Grange Hall. The home block, gone, grubbed up and hauled off in the same week as the fall crush, replaced already with young vines of a currently fashionable varietal nobody in the valley had been told to expect. The pomace dumped on Nora's land hadn't been ordinary crush waste at all. It had been the last physical remnant of vines that had stood on that estate since its founding, root systems and the soil life built up around them for the better part of a century. Gone in an afternoon, trucked off as garbage because disposing of it properly would have meant admitting, publicly, what the estate had actually done. Nora hadn't saved a stubborn woman's grudge match out of spite. She'd accidentally preserved, multiplied, and grown into something usable, the only surviving trace of a vineyard block an entire wine region assumed still existed. Word didn't spread carefully after that. It spread the way real scandal spreads in a wine region that prizes heritage and history above almost everything else, fast. Indignant, and impossible to walk back. Nora's telephone rang more in 1 week than it had the entire previous year combined. A heritage viticulture society 2 counties over called first, asking careful, urgent questions about exactly how much finished compost she had on hand. Then came a call from a Napa estate she'd only ever read about in trade bulletins. Then 3 more, in a single afternoon, until Frank finally started answering the phone himself just so Nora could keep working. It came to a head that October at the Regional Growers Exposition in Santa Rosa, where Nora had reserved a small, unremarkable table mostly out of habit. By mid-morning she wasn't sitting at that table anymore. She was standing behind it, surrounded 3 and 4 deep by vineyard managers and estate owners all talking over each other, all asking some version of the same question: how much was available, how soon, and whether she'd already promised it to somebody else first. If you've ever watched people who once looked past you completely suddenly need something only you could give them, tell me in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Because Nora didn't just build a better compost. She accidentally became the last living connection to something an entire wine region thought had already been lost for good. Subscribe now, because you won't want to miss what she decides to do with that kind of leverage. The visit Nora least expected came the following week, when Gerald Fenn's car pulled into her driveway again, a full year almost to the week since the pomace first appeared on her back field, and only days after the story of the estate's quietly destroyed home block had finally reached a wine trade newsletter that heritage circles across the region actually read. He didn't apologize. Nora hadn't expected him to, and he didn't disappoint that expectation, though his usual smooth composure was noticeably thinner than she remembered it. The estate would like to discuss purchasing a portion of your compost, he said. Given the circumstances, ownership feels it would be appropriate to have some material from the home block returned to the property in some form. Nora looked at him a long moment, thinking about the smell that had woken her a year earlier. The deputy who couldn't prove anything, the months of turning windrows by hand while half the valley assumed she was simply coping badly with losing a fight she was never going to win. You threw 3 generations of that block away for free, Mr. Fenn, and didn't tell a soul what you'd done until it became a problem for you. I find it interesting you're prepared to pay for a piece of it back now that everyone knows. Circumstances change, Fenn said, and had the decency, at least, not to pretend otherwise. She didn't say yes immediately, and she didn't say no out of spite either. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took to walk Fenn through the finished compost pile herself, letting him see precisely how much careful, unglamorous labor had gone into turning his company's dumped waste, and, as it turned out, his company's own erased history, into something his own estate now needed back. In the end, she agreed to sell them a modest supply, at her price, on her terms, delivered after every other buyer already waiting in line ahead of them. She wasn't interested in punishing them by refusing outright. She was interested in being paid fairly for something real she'd built, by people who'd once assumed she had no way to fight back at all, and who now understood exactly how wrong that assumption had been. Frank watched the whole exchange from the barn doorway, saying nothing until Fenn's car pulled back out onto the county road. Never thought I'd see the day they'd be the ones asking, he said. Neither did I, Nora admitted. But here we are. By the following spring, Nora was selling composted pomace to 7 different operations across Corda Valley and beyond. A waiting list stretched out longer than she and Frank could comfortably fill on their own, including, at the very back of that list, a modest standing order from the very estate that had once dumped it on her land for free. She expanded her composting operation carefully, the same deliberate pace she'd used learning the process in the first place. Never taking on more than she and Frank could manage properly, never selling out the integrity of the process just because demand had suddenly outpaced supply. Owen Castellano became one of her earliest regular customers, buying enough each season to treat his own small vineyard, the skepticism from that first feed store conversation long since replaced by a standing weekly order. Renata Cross stayed on as a consultant even after the science had proven itself, helping Nora refine the process further. The two of them building something neither had quite expected out of a disaster neither of them had asked for, and, as it turned out of a piece of history somebody else had tried very hard to make disappear. Nora stood at the edge of her back field the following autumn, the same ground that had once reeked of fermenting waste dumped there to break her, now organized into neat working windrows that had become the most valuable acreage on her entire farm. She still kept that first ledger entry from the morning she found the pomace, right alongside the growing list of buyers who now called her, instead of the other way around, when crush season approached each fall. Not as a trophy. Just as a record of exactly how wrong somebody's assumption about a woman with nothing but stubbornness and 80 acres had turned out to be, and how much more than they knew they'd actually handed her that night. The valley didn't change everything overnight. Gerald Fenn never once personally acknowledged what his company had actually done to her land, and Nora had stopped needing him to. But every fall now, when crush season came around, more than one winery in Corda Valley found themselves calling her first. That was enough. That was, in fact, everything. Everything Nora discovered in this story is grounded in real, documented viticultural science. Grape pomace, the skins, seeds, stems, and pulp left over after pressing, is rich in nitrogen, potassium, calcium, and organic matter, making it a genuinely valuable resource when it's composted properly rather than simply discarded. Raw pomace, dumped without treatment, is a real problem. It's acidic, attracts pests, and can actually damage soil and plants nearby. But composted correctly, typically blended with straw and manure and carefully managed for moisture and temperature, it becomes a rich soil amendment that vineyards actively use to rebuild organic matter and support long-term soil health. This practice underpins organic and biodynamic viticulture certification programs used by wine estates around the world, from major producing regions in Europe to vineyards right here in California. It's real science, turning what the wine industry treats as waste into one of the most valuable things you can put back into a vineyard's soil. The twist in this story reflects something real too. Vineyard soils that have supported the same vine roots for generations really do develop distinct, established communities of beneficial fungi and bacteria. Soil biology that takes decades to build and can't simply be recreated once old vines are removed. When a historic block is pulled out, that particular soil community is effectively lost with it. Composting the plant material from a mature vineyard, whether by accident or by design, can preserve and multiply a version of that biology in a way that's otherwise gone for good, which is exactly why old vine heritage and soil continuity matter so much to serious vineyards, even when nobody's watching. If this is the kind of real agricultural science you want more of, this channel exists specifically to dig up stories like Nora's, where the truth is just as compelling as anything fiction could invent. Subscribe, and tell us in the comments which detail in this story surprised you the most.